Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, November 10th, 2008, President George W. Bush meets with President-elect Barack Obama behind closed doors for nearly 2 hours. It was Barack Obama's first time inside the Oval Office, and this meeting sort of signaled the start of the transition between the Bush terms and the Obama terms. Now, this wasn't any old transition, though. The country was in the middle of an economic spiral, was coming off of a historic election. There was a real sense of stakes and questions about balance when it came to, well, who was really leading the country through that crisis. So does any of this sound familiar, folks? Here to discuss the Bush-Obama transition and presidential transitions in general is, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Niki.
Hello, Jody.
And we can talk a little bit about 2020, but I want to go back, not even just to 2008, but way back, and start maybe with some bigger context, which is elections are in November, as you know. Inaugurations are in January, as you know. Why so much time in between? Why do transitions take so damn long?
Well, first, historically, they're shorter than they used to be, if that's any comfort. It used to be that presidents used to be sworn in on March 4th. And in part because, news took longer to travel, as did people. So it just took a long time to get everyone the information they needed to transition to a new government. But also it takes a long time to stand up a government.
Yeah.
And in 1932, the 20th Amendment is passed through Congress saying that actually we need this to go a little quicker, people. And it was finally ratified in 1933. And you could imagine people really wanted that in effect in 1932 because Franklin Roosevelt wins the election in November and the country has to wait 4 long months before they finally get a new president who can address the existential economic crisis that's crushing the country during that period.
Yeah, and I've seen people this conversation break out and people say, gosh, it really seems like it takes a long time. In other countries, right, I think in the UK, it's the prime minister walks out of 10 Downing Street and hands the keys over the next morning. I mean, I go back and forth. I get that frustration about how long it takes. And I do agree, especially in these moments of crisis, you end up with some of the dynamics that we'll talk about. But I also sort of see it this period where you do get to set up your government. And if all of a sudden the next president was on the clock and the expectations were they were going to start solving the problems right away, well, it takes a long time to, bring new people in and figure out the new passwords on the computers and all those things. So it's sort of borrowed time. It is sort of a little bit of a period in which you get the flywheel going or whatever. But I don't know. It feels shorter than this, but maybe not right away is the right answer is what I'm trying to say.
I think in these periods, you're just come the hell on. It's time. When people have voted, it's time to get a new government in there, especially in the middle of a crisis, when it seems especially urgent, but especially in the middle of a crisis when you feel like the current government is not doing its job. That was the big thing in 1932, right? Was that the feeling that the Hoover administration was not doing enough to address the depression and that something needed to be done. It's a little different in 2008. There's open lines of communication about the economic crisis and how it's unfolding. I think that there is this desire to have these things happen more quickly, but standing up a government, there are thousands of jobs that need to be filled. There's a cabinet that needs to be assembled. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And it's work that these campaigns have been doing for months now, right? The transition projects that start pretty early on.
Yeah, and I mean, let's go to 2008 and talk a little bit about that dynamics there. But yes, I do think there was a sense of we're in this moment of crisis. Bush knew he was no longer going to be president, right? That's part of it. And so they had reached out as the crisis was unfolding to the Obama teams and the McCain teams. Mm-hmm. And so there wasn't this sense of, oh, okay, this is no longer our problem, once the election's over. And that might be a little slightly different dynamic than to right now. We'll see. But, I also, by the same token, do feel like there was this real sense of, okay, now Obama's been elected. We have this crisis in front of us. Obama is speaking publicly about it, as he has been throughout the election. Who do we turn to? Who's calling the shots here? And I mean, obviously, the person calling the shots is the person who's president until January, but there's also that other kind of leading a nation kind of thing, which also matters a lot. So how do you remember that time, and how did the two sides kind of navigate it?
I remember that same feeling, which is you're kind of done with the old president, right? And this is that idea of a lame duck session, right? Yeah. Where everybody's been kicked out of their jobs and they're just keeping the lights on until the new guy comes in. But I think that the Obama transition team was very clear, like, we are not president yet. We're getting together our plans. We're trying to communicate to you what we're planning to do, because you need that kind of sense of stability, especially when it comes to financial and economic policy. There needs to be some predictability about what's going to happen next. So they're signaling what they're going to do, but they're trying to make very clear, look, there's still a president in place. That president is going to continue to preside over this until it's time for us to take the wheel.
Yeah, and I remember, I don't want to say too much about this, but I remember some little controversies about that kind of like, well, who's in charge thing. I mean, I think, Obama was giving press conferences where he was trying to act presidential. I think there were some press conferences where he brought out his entire expected cabinet once he had sort of announced that. There was even a little hubbub. It may have been during the election itself, but I feel like some people gave him a hard time for using a seal that was like presidential-esque. I mean, maybe these were more than anything just the sort of signs of the little scandals that were going to continue to pop up during the Obama administration. But yeah, it was just a sign of these little things of like, well, how do you step around this and how do you navigate this?
Yeah, this is really challenging for transition teams because you do have to spend a lot of time before the election even happens figuring out how you're going to transition into office if that eventuality comes to pass. But then you get criticized for kind of like measuring the drapes, that you're too early eyeing that Oval Office and assuming you're going to win. And there's some arrogance or some cockiness around that. And that's a media narrative, right? Like, absolutely, these campaigns need to be doing the work of transition well before we know who wins the election. Because again, it's a huge, huge job, and it requires that level of planning.
Yeah, it kind of, gets to this larger question of just what are the expectations for a new president. It reminds me of this Michael Bloomberg quote, actually, that when he first took over, and this was more related to that whole first 100 days thing, which we'll do an episode about that at some point. But, Bloomberg was asked, what did you accomplish in your first 100 days? And he said, well, I hired my team. I got my team in place. And he was like, people don't understand that's a lot of work, and that's the actual work. And 100 days is perfectly reasonable to spend your first 100 days just getting your team in order and getting a functioning government up. But instead, there's these expectations that you should be, notching tons of wins. So again, it gets to this question of what kind of work is being done and whether that work satisfies, as you said, a kind of external narrative. But yes, the work that is being done right now to set up teams, to transition, to just convey information, to declassify information, all that is very important and should count as real work. Let's talk a little bit about some of the nuts and bolts of it, actually. I mean, there is funding for this. It is an actual sort of project that has its own rules and regulations. So what do we know about how a transition actually operates?
So this kind of started by the 1963 Presidential Transitions Act that kind of lays the groundwork for this idea that an incoming administration, it needs office space, it needs funds in order to sort of bridge those now about 2.5 months between the election and the inauguration. And it needs things like security clearances. So in 1948, Harry Truman is running for re-election, and it's the Dewey campaign that starts to get these national security briefings because you've entered the Cold War. And there's this sense that there's real threat out there and that whoever is going to take the reins needs to be prepared, something that Harry Truman wasn't actually prepared for when FDR dies, right? He had to be read into the whole national security apparatus. So he wanted to make sure that somebody else coming into the presidency wasn't caught off guard. And this was true, too, for President Obama. There was a new law passed in 2004 that made sure that people started to get their security clearances right away early in the pre-transition period so that they would be ready to hit the ground running on national security issues. Now, these things have been amended over and over and over again to provide more money, to provide more formality to the process. But there is a real legal process here, which starts off with the General Services Administration saying, hello, President-elect, here's the keys to the transition offices, here's your money, go to town.
And that's like a phone call that happens the day after the election is certified or something?
Yeah, I mean, there's an official letter that happens, but actually Chris Liu, who was the executive director of the Obama-Biden transition in 2008, talks about how he went to bed early on election night while everybody else was out partying, and he got up early in order to start this work of the transition. And at 1 a.m., he had missed a call from the GSA director saying, all right, you guys are in. I'm sending you everything that you need.
Do you, what's your direct deposit information? Here come the $9.62 million for transition activities. But this is another thing to me that brings up an eternal question, and one I think we've seen especially over the last 4 years, which is how much of the way our government works is laws and regulation, and how much is it built actually on norms. And I think we've seen time and again that it's the norms and the good faith actions that were actually the thing that was at the heart of a functioning government. And so there's tons of examples through the years of, yes, there's been these attempts to create laws and create funds, but there's tons of examples over the years of just transitions that just sort of have their act together and are respectful of the process, and others that maybe don't. So we'll start with 2008, and then I think we can bring up some other examples. But I think famously the sense is that the Obama team was very impressed with how the Bush team handled that handoff, right?
Yeah, this is considered one of the smoothest running transitions that we know of in the modern era. And it's in large part because the Bush team, again, was done with its 2 terms. It knew it was getting ready to transition, but it also took very seriously both the fact that there was an economic crisis happening, but also this was the first wartime transition since 1968. The U.S. was involved in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and successfully transitioning governments in those precarious situations required very good planning, and the Bush team took it very, very seriously.
Yeah. So some other examples maybe on the other end. I think in the modern era, the biggest example of a poorly run transition, Clinton in 92, as he was coming into office, by all accounts, did not run the smoothest transition and get up to speed as smoothly as others had.
Yeah, his team was pretty disorganized, and he was trying to blend sort of his Arkansas people with new Washington people, and he just ended up taking these endless meetings, which is a very Clinton-esque thing to do, to always be running behind, to be kind of disorganized. And so in this period in which he was supposed to be trying to organize his new government, you started to get a glimpse of a president who just wasn't able to sort of keep things structured in a way that you would see throughout his presidency, that he was somebody who wasn't the most disciplined when it came to running the government in many ways, obviously, but in these very basic ways.
Right, and that's a good point that, the transition is an early sign of how someone is going to run things and make choices and just sort of serve as an executive, which is a big part of the job. And let's end with the other end of the Clinton presidency, because there were also lots of tidbits and rumors about what happened when Clinton was on the way out. To me, I feel like one of the first just kind of like little random semi-controversies in my sort of political awareness, but just remembering hearing about when the Clinton team was leaving, they apparently left the White House in total disarray. There were even rumors, tell me if you think they're true or not true, but that Clinton staffers, as Bush was coming in, had removed all the W's from the keyboards in the White House. And so I just remember it as this little like weird but sort of salacious political scandal.
Absolutely.
At the beginning of the Bush term, yeah.
If that's your first salacious political scandal, I'm sorry that you missed all the good ones in the 90s. No, I mean, there's some truth to this, right? I think that there ended up being about $13,000 worth of damage done by the outgoing administration. Sounds like a lot of money. Look, were a few W's taken? I believe so. Were some carelessness taken with how they handled the furniture and the walls on the way out? I think so. It's probably been overblown a bit. And it was something that was also true when they were coming in, that the outgoing George H.W. Bush administration folks were not necessarily so orderly on their way out. But yes, I think that was something, though, that had an impact on George W. Bush, and one of the reasons he wanted to make his own transition out so orderly, because he did feel stung by that sense that there was this sort of like last FU on the way out.
Yeah, and the Clinton folks will push back against that idea of leaving a kind of FU, but they will say, like, it was just standard issue. You're leaving a job, you're packing up, you're tired, you want to go home, and you're just going to kind of leave your office a bit of a mess, which again is not the kindest thing to do, but I've left jobs before, and my sense in that is like, well, I'm going to take the books I want, and everything else is not my problem anymore, and my desk might not be the neatest it could possibly be. Not to put too much weight on it, but again, it's another, like, in the narrative of the story an administration tells about a transition, it is that kind of the first act. And certainly the Trump folks feel like they were totally scorned in their transition, and I think they've held on to that. I think the George W. Bush folks felt a little bit of that, and so the table manners of this stuff does matter a little bit, I think.
And it reflects what's going on more broadly in the country, right? Remember how contentious the 2000 election was, how brutally unwelcomed George W. Bush was to Washington, D.C. And so I think that the little slights stung more because they already had this sense that they weren't welcome.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Special shout out to Kaula Nakua, who does the transcripts every episode. You can find a link to those at thisdaypod.com. You can also find a forum where you can get in touch with any comments or questions about the show at thisdaypod.com, or email us thisdaypod@gmail.com. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon. All right.
Radiotopia.